Something found at Qumran in 1947 should not have survived. Kamung. The sealed clay jars, recovered from Cave 4 in the Judean desert, wrapped in linen beside the oldest known fragments of the Hebrew scriptures, lay a text that the institutional church had spent 16 centuries methodically erasing. Not a commentary, not a marginal gloss appended to an accepted book, a complete sequential account of events that Genesis names but refuses to explain. Scholars catalogued it as fragments of 1 Enoch. Paleographic analysis placed the manuscript tradition no later than the 2nd century BCE, predating the New Testament by centuries. What the announcement of that discovery did not say clearly, and what popular accounts of the Dead Sea Scrolls continue to pass over quickly, is this: the specific chapters preserved at Qumran contain something that the Genesis account conspicuously lacks: a reason. The Watchers did not descend because desire overcame them. According to the chapter that almost no major Bible commentary has ever printed beside Genesis 6 in a study Bible, they gathered, they held a meeting, they bound themselves together with a specific oath on a specific mountain. They came down to earth, not in a moment of weakness, but in pursuit, in pursuit of a purpose they named and agreed upon before a single one of them moved. Question Genesis raises in 11 verses, and then abandons entirely, is not what the Watchers did after they arrived. Questioned is why the stated purpose they gave was removed from the account the world was permitted to read. The mainstream account of Genesis 6 is familiar to anyone shaped by Western Christianity or Judaism as it has been practiced since the 5th century. Sons of God looked upon the daughters of men, found them beautiful, and took them as wives. From those unions came the Nephilim, described in the text as the heroes of old, the men of renown. God observed that the wickedness of humanity had become great. The flood followed. This is the account that appears in every major Bible translation, every seminary curriculum, and every systematic theology from Geneva, Nashville. It is presented as a self-contained story. Tread the 11 verses of Genesis 6 carefully, and the incompleteness becomes unavoidable. Who exactly were the sons of God? Genesis does not say. What specifically provoked God's decision to send the flood? The text names corruption and wickedness, but identifies no mechanism. What happened to the sons of God themselves after the flood? Genesis offers nothing. What were the Nephilim in physical and biological terms? The text gives a name and the phrase heroes of old, but no origin account and no physical description. Mainstream scholarship has operated with a text that raises 4 foundational questions and answers none of them directly. Dominant interpretation, since Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 5th century CE, identifies the sons of God as the righteous line of Seth, intermarrying with the unrighteous line of Cain. This reading became the standard of Catholic and Protestant teaching for the precise reason it eliminated the supernatural element. Here is the detail that almost no one mentions. The phrase used in Genesis 6:2 is Bene Elohim. This specific phrase appears in 3 other locations in the Hebrew scriptures. Job 1:6 describes the Bene Elohim presenting themselves before God in the heavenly court. Job 2:1 uses the exact phrase again for the same divine assembly. Job 38:7 uses it to describe the beings who shouted for joy at the creation of the earth. In all three cases, without exception, it refers to divine beings in the supernatural court of God. Sethite interpretation requires accept the reader to Genesis 6 uses a technical phrase with a fixed and consistent meaning across every other instance of its use in the text, and then abandons that meaning without notice or explanation. And no Hebrew grammar requires that reading. No other passage in the scriptures uses Bene Elohim for human beings. The earliest Jewish interpreters, the translators of the Septuagint, the scribes at Qumran, and the first century historian Josephus all read Genesis 6 as what the Hebrew says. Divine beings crossed a boundary they were never supposed to cross. The Book of Enoch does not begin with metaphor or prophecy. It begins with a list. In chapter 6 of 1 Enoch, the text names them. Semiaza was their leader. Azazel was among them. Amaros, Prakel, Tamiel, Parakel, Danel, Ezekiel, Brachjalasiel, Armers, Batajel, Ananel, Zakel, Samsapael, Turel, Jomiel, Sariel, 200 of them gathered together. And text identifies the location of their gathering with a specificity that the Genesis account entirely lacks. The summit of Mount Hermon, Hebrew name underlying that mountain, is not incidental. Hermon in Hebrew is derived from the root Cherem. The word Cherem in biblical Hebrew does not mean a geographical feature or a neutral place name. Cherem means a thing consecrated to destruction. It means devoted to the ban, given over entirely to a sacred curse, placed beyond retrieval. It is the same root used throughout the war narratives of Deuteronomy and Joshua, when cities and peoples are described as Cherem, put under the sacred ban, destroyed to the last stone, beyond exemption or redemption. The Watchers did not gather on a convenient elevated location. They chose a mountain whose Hebrew name encodes in its root consonants the precise nature of the oath they were about to take. They were standing on Cherem when they bound themselves together. That is deliberate textual encoding, not coincidence. And then Semi-Yaza speaks. In 1 Enoch, chapter 6, verse 3, he tells the assembled 200 that he fears he will bear the burden of punishment alone if they proceed without a shared oath. He is not speaking out of passion. He is anticipating institutional consequences. He is proposing a collective covenant, specifically so that no single being can be made to bear the guilt and the others exempted. Follows in the text is not an impulsive act. It is a governance decision. 200 named beings take a binding oath together and then descend in an organized group. 2. The Book of Enoch was preserved in two independent textual traditions with no institutional connection between them. Community at Qumran. The community at Qumran kept multiple manuscript fragments across several caves, representing different copying traditions and different centuries of use, suggesting the text was read continuously over generations as authoritative scripture. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved the Book of Enoch in its canonical Bible without interruption from the earliest period of Ethiopian Christianity to the present day. The Ethiopian Canon includes it alongside the 66 books of the Protestant tradition, treating it as fully authoritative and reading it in liturgy. Two communities separated by geography, by language, by centuries, and by completely distinct theological traditions. both independently recognized the same text as foundational. Dual preservation is itself a historical argument. What two unconnected communities independently protect across 15 centuries is worth examining more carefully than what one institution decided to exclude. The Sumerian records do not use the word watchers. They use Anunnaki. The Sumerian compound breaks into its component, meaning as those who came from heaven to earth. The oldest Sumerian king list, recovered from the archaeological site at Nippur and dated to the early 3rd millennium BCE, records a period before the historical dynasties of Sumer when divine beings ruled the earth directly. Pre-dynastic rulers are not presented as mythology. They are given specific reigns, measured in specific years, assigned to specific cities. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest continuous narrative texts in the archaeological record, describes a subgroup of the Anunnaki designated as the Igigi, divine beings assigned to a function of cosmic labor and observation, who grew restless in their station, descended to the earth, and interacted with the human population in ways that produced offspring of mixed origin. High divine authority, Enlil, responds to the resulting disorder and the growth of the hybrid population with a catastrophic flood. The structural correspondence to 1 Enoch is not atmospheric or vague. It is point for point divine beings with an assigned cosmic function and authority structure they violated. A descent made by the deliberate choice rather than compulsion. Unions with human women. Hybrid offspring that disrupted the created order, and a divine response in the form of a global flood. Sumerians developed this complete account in the 3rd millennium BCE, in complete independence from the Hebrew tradition, with no access to Genesis, and no knowledge of a text that would one day be called the Book of Enoch. The Greeks recorded the same account in their own language and their own framework. In Hesiod's Theogony, composed in the 8th century BCE, the Titans are divine beings of the first cosmic age who violated the boundaries of the divine order and were punished by permanent imprisonment. Hesiod names individual Titans, names their leader, and describes their confinement in terms that parallel the imprisonment of the Watchers with specific precision. Titans are cast into Tartarus, a prison beneath the earth, surrounded by bronze walls, locked behind iron gates, guarded by the children of the storm winds. 10. In 1 Enoch, chapter 10, the archangel Raphael receives specific instructions to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness beneath the rough rocks of the desert, where he will remain until the day of judgment. The word used in the Aramaic text for the confinement of the Watchers is a word meaning a pit beneath the earth. The Greek word Tartarus describes the same location. Underground, beneath the surface of the world, a place of permanent binding, hid. The second letter of Peter in the New Testament, chapter 2, verse 4, uses the Greek verb tartaru, describing the thriving fate of the sinning angels. God cast them into Tartarus and committed them to chains of darkness until judgment. A New Testament author, writing in the 1st century CE, uses the Greek word for the prison of the Titans when describing the fate of the Watchers. These two traditions were not in documented contact during their foundational periods. They are describing the same location in the same terms, drawn from two independent cultural memory systems. The Hindu tradition provides the third independent witness. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedic texts, composed in Sanskrit in a period most scholars place between 1500 and 1200 BCE, describes celestial beings called Gandharvas, cosmic figures assigned a function in the divine order who crossed the boundary between their realm and the human world. So the Mahabharata and the later Puranic texts elaborate the Gandharva tradition extensively. They descended, they interacted with mortal women. Their offspring disrupted the natural hierarchy of the created order. The mechanism in the Hindu account is structurally identical to the mechanism in 1 Enoch, in the Sumerian Atrahasis epic, and in the Greek theogony, divine beings with an assigned function in the cosmic hierarchy cross a boundary they are not permitted to cross, produce hybrid offspring, and require a response from the higher divine authority to restore the original order. 3 civilizations developing in complete independence from one another across 3 different continents in 3 different languages, with no documented contact routes during their foundational periods. All record the same core event with the same structural architecture, same sequence of cause and effect, and the same resolution involving divine judgment. The statistical probability that this convergence is the result of independent coincidence is effectively zero. And what is far more probable, and what the evidence from all 3 traditions together makes the rational conclusion, is that all 3 are drawing from a common memory of events that actually occurred. The Book of Enoch was not always for biddings. In the 1st century CE, it circulated alongside the accepted scriptures in Jewish and early Christian communities and across the Mediterranean. Disgracer. The letter of Jude, which appears in the New Testament canon, accepted by every major Christian tradition, quotes it directly in verses 14 and 15. Jude identifies the source by name, Enoch, the 7th from Adam. He cites a specific prophecy from the text as authoritative scripture. This is not an allusion or a vague echo. It is a citation. The 2nd letter of P2, chapter 2, verse 4, references divine beings who sinned and were cast into Tartarus, an event with no account in Genesis, but with a complete narrative in 1 Enoch, chapters 6 through 16. Tertullian, one of the most prolific Latin fathers of the early church, writing in the late 2nd century CE, explicitly defended the Book of Enoch as authentic and canonical scripture, arguing that its survival from the antediluvian period through Enoch's own hand was a sufficient proof of its validity. Origen of Alexandria, whose influence on early Christian theology is among the most extensive of any pre-Nicene figure, treated the Enochian material as authoritative in his commentaries. Text was not peripheral or marginal in the early church. It was present at the center of the reading community. The institutional removal happened at a specific moment in a specific room. The Council of Laodicea, convened in 363 CE in what is now Western Turkey, under the authority of the newly Christianized Roman imperial structure, issued a formal canon list. The Book of Enoch was not on it. Jerome, completing his Latin Vulgate translation in 405 CE and establishing the biblical text that would dominate Western Christianity for the next 1,000 years, did not include it. From that point forward, the text that Jude had cited by name was effectively inaccessible to the Western Christian world. Not because it was considered inauthentic, not because scholars had produced evidence of forgery or late composition. Dead Sea Scroll fragments recovered in 1947 confirmed that the manuscript tradition at Qumran predated the Common Era, placing the text centuries before the New Testament. The exclusion at Laodicea was not a scholarly determination. It was an institutional decision, and the motivation was not textual. It was theological. Chapter 6 of 1. Enoch does not present the Watchers as beings overcome by desire, presents them as beings who made a plan organize themselves, swore a collective oath to ensure shared liability, and descended with a stated purpose. Question their stated purpose raised concerning the nature of angelic will, the boundaries of divine sovereignty, and the specific reason 200 named beings would choose to forfeit their station permanently, was a question the institutionalizing church of the 4th century had decided not to place in the hands of the general population. What does the complete picture look like when Genesis 6, the Book of Enoch, the Sumerian recorders, the Greek theogony, and the Hindu Vedic tradition are assembled together without the institutional filter applied in 363 CE? The sons of God, the Bene Elohim of Genesis 6, are the Irin of the Aramaic tradition. The word Irin is the Aramaic designation for the Watchers, and the root of Irin is the Aramaic verb meaning to be awake, to watch without ceasing. They were not called watchers, because they happened to observe something. Wakefulness was their function in the cosmic order, to witness, to observe, to remain perpetually alert in their assigned station. When they descended on Mount Hermon and swore their collective oath on the mountain of Cherem, they were not abandoning themselves to impulse. They were abandoning their function, pact. They were choosing, with full knowledge of the consequences, to vacate the role they were created to fill. The Hebrew word for their offspring, Nephilim, carries within it both meanings available in the causative and passive forms of the root naphal, those who fell and those who cause others to fall. The name Im is an indictment and a warning encoded in the same words simultaneously. A second Hebrew term in Genesis 6:12 deserves the full weight of its original meaning, because every major English translation reduces it to a shadow. The phrase is sol, a sol basar. Most English Bibles render it as all flesh or all living creatures. But basar in Hebrew means flesh in its most physical and biological sense. The material substance of biological existence at the cellular level. When Genesis 6:12 says kol basar had corrupted its way on the earth, it is not using a metaphor for moral decline. The text is describing of biological matter itself, comprehensive in scope, not confined to one species and not confined to one generation. The Book of Jasher and the Book of Jubilees, two ancient sources that expand the Genesis account, both describe the crossing of species categories during the pre-flood era with biological specificity that the four words kol basar in Genesis 6:12 encode in compressed form. The Watchers did not introduce sin in the abstract. According to the complete account, they introduced a corruption of kol basar, every category of living biological matter from root to branch. The warning in Matthew 24, verse 37, requires the complete record to land with its full weight. Jesus says, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." He does not say as it was in the days of David or as it was in the days of the judges. He does not reach for any of the many errors of moral failure catalogued in the historical books of the Hebrew scriptures. He names Noah. He names the specific period defined by the specific event that is only fully comprehensible when the chapters removed at Laodicea are returned to their place beside Genesis 6. The days of Noah are not a general metaphor for wickedness. They are a reference to the specific pattern that 1 Enoch chapter 6 documents with names, numbers, a location, and an oath. Divine beings crossing boundaries they understood, producing disruption at the level of Kol Basar, in a world that continued its daily rhythms of eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, and appearing entirely normal from the outside, while something fundamental to the structure of the created order was being altered beneath the surface. The chapter sealed in Cave 4 at Qumran and preserved without interruption in the Ethiopian Orthodox Canon was not removed from the Western record because it was false. It was removed because the reason the Watchers gave was specific enough to be examined, organized enough to require an answer, and purpose raised question. Enough, the 4th century church had no institutional framework to address publicly. The Watchers did not fall. They descended. They chose to come. And the reason they stated on the mountain Cherem, preserved in the chapter that was buried under 16 centuries of institutional silence, and then found again in a sealed jar in the Judean desert, is the reason that everything that followed, the Nephilim, the corruption of Kol Basar, the flood, the binding of 200 named beings beneath the hills of the earth, the warning spoken from a hillside in Galilee 2,000 years later, makes complete and terrible sense.